Welcome. Hello and welcome to episode 11 of my podcast, whatever I'm going to call it. Today I am going to continue with Howard Sachar's History of Israel, from the rise of Zionism to our time. You can go back to episode 7 and see part 1, where I start at the very beginning. And I'll kind of do a little bit of a recap. That way we're not just starting out of nowhere, in case you've never heard the earlier stuff. And I can probably sum it up a lot quicker here. I rarely get a chance to really do this. I rarely get a chance to even read. Most of my life is spent working and taking care of business. Business I'd rather not always attend to. Some of it is fun, some of it is interesting. There's always something to learn. But I get bogged down, and it is definitely a chore for me to break away from my everyday life to get behind a book and actually read something, and then take the time to try and remember it and report back on it. Yeah, this is part 2, and we're on, I think, episode 11 now. So the first part I did starts out in the first decade of the 19th century with Napoleon granting citizenship to all the Jews of his occupied lands, in keeping with the idealistic aims of the revolution, with the expectation that the Jews would forego their own cultures and collective interests and assimilate into the countries of their residence. And this was successful up to a point, but as we shall see, was not sustainable. Meanwhile, in Russia, and I feel like I'm giving a news report. Meanwhile, in Russia and Eastern Europe, where Jews lived a life of greater oppression, there was more of a tendency to cleave to traditional and religious practices, keeping them within a strict dedication to their culture. These Jews of Russia held tighter to their aspirations of returning to their ancient homeland. But for the Western, more modernized and secular Jews, the Zionist dream was fading. Then, in the 1840s, in Eastern Europe, there arose an underground movement of writers inspired to commit to a campaign of colonization in the Holy Land as a prerequisite to a fulfillment of a messianic age where God would return to his people. Thus, modern political Zionism was born. This, in addition to an alleviation of oppression in Russia under Alexander II, led to an awakening in the Jewish community, where a professional, financial, and humanistic renaissance called Haskalah would ready the Jewish people for their return to Israel. This movement, although productive in improving the abilities of the Jewish people, drew them somewhat out of the messianic mindset that set the ball rolling to begin with, into secularism, although it did bring them back in touch with their Hebrew language for their everyday life. Nevertheless, if the Zionist dream was to be fulfilled, the secular Jews were going to have to be reeled back in to some extent, and a new approach would be necessary. So that what basically sums up episode 7. So moving forward, The Haskalah writers portrayed Zion as a sort of mythical paradise where the Jews could return to a sort of former glory and regain touch with their ancestral home. During the 1870s, the Hebrew language journals reflected a growing concern that the enlightenment of this new generation of secularly educated Jews would divert them from a common identification with their awaited fate and fortunes. One such journal, The Dawn, founded and edited by Perez Smolenskin, a Russian Jew, in addition to Smolenskin's other works, helped lay the foundation of literary realism in the Hebrew language. Because until the 1950s, Hebrew had been consigned to synagogue and religious school. Smolenskin also warned against the extravagances of Haskalah. He feared that Haskalah was causing Jewish humanists to reject their ancestral loyalties. Which brings us to the new approach by which they hope to reel back in the secular Jews towards a proper orientation for their return to the homeland. He believed in a sort of Jewish nationalism. He thought Judaism, in its Western European conception as a strictly religious confession, was bankrupt. The time had come to sort of market this as a resurrection of the Jewish people as a national identity. Smolenskin actively fought the Haskalah notion that secular modernism, rather than national revival, was the answer to the Jews' problems in Europe. Okay, so this next section of the book is called European Nationalism and Russian Upheaval. During a prevailing upheaval of Western and Eastern European nationalism in general, the early Zionist leaders saw an opportunity to draw on this fervor and inspire more Jews to rally to their cause. With so many other nations striving merely for the sake of their own national honor, how much more should they assert themselves for the glory of God who chose Zion? Why should they be any less worthy? Micah Joseph Lebensohn, Perez Smolenskin, Leo Pinsker, Eliezer Perlman were some of the early personages of that movement. Moses Hess, who went to school with Karl Marx, married a prostitute out of socialist compassion. Of course he did. Socialist cucks, right? He published his first book, The Holy History of Mankind, by a young Spinozist in 1837, which flopped. He later occupied himself with political journalism. His Jewish interests were revived by the anti-Semitism of cosmopolitan Western Europe. In 1857, he discovered the writings of Kalischer and began a systematic study of Jewish history. He also became engrossed in the writings of Italian nationalist Mazzini and was inspired by the fulfillment of Mazzini's dream of a united Italy. Ironically, Mazzini had also inspired Giovanni Gentile, one of the founders of the fascist movement. These influences inspired Hess's second book, Rome and Jerusalem, in 1862. In this way, he reunited with his people. Hess's encounters with European nationalism, in addition to his studies in ethnicity, persuaded him to abandon his previous cosmopolitan visions of a single homogeneity of nations. He wrote that each people nurtured its own individual traits, ambitions, and mission. The events taking place in Italy confirmed that view. What the Italians and others had achieved must also be achieved by the Jews, who represented the last great national problem in Europe. No less did the Jews have a mission in Palestine. A national renaissance was needed to endow the religious genius of the Jews with new strength and again raise its soul to the level of prophetic inspiration. Hesse's book, Rome and Jerusalem, prefigured later Zionist doctrines. He predated Borochov and Herzl, asserting that return to Israel was needed for Jews to shed their status as an historical anomaly, vulnerable phantom, and social parasite in other people's lands, and self-transform themselves into a normal people able to organize on correct socialist principles. His words, not mine. Hess foretold the collaboration of other governments in helping revive a Jewish nation in the Middle East, including active help from sympathetic powers like the Rothschilds, Montefiore, and other magnates who would fund and organize Jewish colonization in Palestine. Hesse's book was also an accomplishment of ideological prophecy. But even with all this, the book was, again, a flop. Hesse's role as a visionary of Zionism would not be widely recognized for another 100 years. Hesse's writings also carried an existential warning for the Jews, not merely religious or national ideals which awaited fulfillment. His theories alluded to not only differences between their people and other nations, but also to the hostility directed at them. He said, "We shall always remain strangers among nations." Given the antipathy between the Jews and the Germans or the Russians, Zionism went from an intellectual theory to an urgent survivalist movement. In the 1860s, Slavophilism gained momentum in the Tsarist Empire. Later, in 1881, with the accession to the throne of Alexander II, Alexander II, after the murder of his father by revolutionaries, there was a period of oppression against all non-Russian ethnic minorities. As he was committed to national homogeneity as the foundation of autocratic power. Among the Latvians, Poles, Estonians, Finns, Armenians, Turkmenians, and others, the Jews found themselves the most vulnerable and suspect of the empire's minorities. Numbering around 5 million in 1897, they remained mostly confined to their Pale of Settlement, an area comprising around 20% of European Russia. They lived in towns and cities, villages and hamlets. To the Tsarist regime, this tightly knit Jewish enclave was the object of enforced Russification and organized counter-revolutionary diversion. the bureaucracy would stigmatize revolutionarism as nothing less than a Jewish conspiracy. In 1881, a series of institutionally inspired pogroms erupted throughout southern Russia and Ukraine, taking many lives and destroying what physical property they had. A year later, a government committee under Count Nikolai Ignatieff issued a report stating that the late Alexander II's policy of toleration had failed, and that harsh measures were in order against Russian Jews. With this, Alexander III issued a series of anti-Jewish decrees which continued until the Revolution of 1917. Okay, I'm going to end it there, because I don't want this to go too long. I want these sections to be somewhat easily digestible, and so that way it doesn't get too tedious, because I know how these things can get, especially when I'm reading them off my notes. Basically, these notes, it's not verbatim from the book, thank God, because this is how much we have to get through, right? So, I mean, it's just very condensed. I just make notes as I read, and I try and formulate it. And I think maybe as I go, I'm going to do a little bit like what I did in the beginning there, where I kind of summarize that first section and just sort of distill it down. But I do like to get into a little bit of the detail. That way not only it gives me a chance to remember it, because I can review these episodes, and so can you. I don't really get a chance to do that very often, but it gives me an opportunity to be able to remember this stuff and know what it is that I'm studying, and what's the reason for all this. Why am I getting into this book? Why this book? The History of Israel, from the Rise of Zionism to Our Time, by Howard M. Sachar. Why am I getting into this? What's the point? Well, the point is, I've noticed that there's a lot of hubbub in the media, and a lot of people have really strong opinions about Israel and about Zionism and Palestine and the whole Israeli-Palestine conflict, and the truth is I don't really know anything about it. I think that it's easy to get like a gut reaction or a knee-jerk reaction to these kinds of things when they're debated. I remember last year when when the Palestinian terrorists were sending rockets into Israel, and they were using their defense system to shoot the missiles out of the sky or whatever. I remember there was a lot of controversy about that, and there seems to be two very polarized narratives surrounding that, and there seems to be a very convoluted history involved. And so why do you think the book is this thick, right? So I kind of wanted to learn a little bit about it and get into it and be able to form kind of my own opinion, because I've learned through my own experience that oftentimes your knee-jerk reactions can be wrong. And so I think it would be good for people to know about this stuff, and I'd like to know about it and be able to form my own opinion based on facts and history. And there's more books than just this one. I've got other books as well. I download a lot of PDFs, and so I've got more books on my computer than I'm ever going to read ever in my life. In this episode, I'd like to get into a few different books, starting with this one, and I'll probably review or continue on a couple of the other books I started within my first 10 episodes. I looked at my first 10 episodes as sort of like a launching pad. And as much as I do want to branch out from there into other things, I want to continue on some of those books as well. Some of the other books that I've reviewed and working through are, well, there's Stranger in a Strange Land, there's The Great Gatsby, there is the Thomas Ligotti stuff, there is the conspiracy stuff, and what else? Yeah, so there's the conspiracy stuff with Catherine Austin Fitts, and I went through Bertrand Russell, I went through Zbigniew Brzezinski. What else was in that section? Oh, Joseph Plummer's Tragedy and Hope 101. Oh, Ayn Rand, The Fountainhead. And I just got Atlas Shrugged. There is... Oh, eventually... Okay, I do want to go through some language stuff. And I might actually do some of that on this episode. Maybe I'll wait. We'll see. I'm working on some Russian and some Spanish. I kind of wanted to it's really tempting to sort of indulge in my vanity and sort of show off my polyglot abilities, because I have some proficiency in 5 different languages, and it's tempting to want to have one episode where I just kind of go off and speak in all these languages, but I don't want to do that because I don't want it to sound prepared or pretentious. Probably what I'm going to do instead is continue my language studies and take you guys with me. So I'd like to show some of my techniques that I use to study language. Because here's the thing. Oftentimes you'll find advertisements and videos on YouTube or wherever else where they say, learn Spanish in 6 weeks, master Russian in 3 days, learn a foreign language in 2 hours. Look, it's all bullshit. There's no way to do that. You cannot learn a foreign language in that amount of time. I can't anyway. I don't know. I can't speak for anybody else. I know I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I've studied several languages, and it takes a long time. It takes a lot of work. Okay. Now there's always that savant that, went to the library and 4 hours learned Icelandic or whatever. That rarely happens. And there are polyglots out there. And there's an art to it. And you sort of pick things up along the way. Now, I've learned some pretty cool tricks. And I'd like to share some of those tricks. I think that's one thing that I might have to offer as a human being. Is, I've always found creative new ways to tackle different things I'm learning. Because learning can be boring. I'm really struggling to get back to my geometry studies because, man, it's tedious and time consuming and brain stretching and all that. And it's really hard to get motivated to do it. As much as I'd like to do it, it's hard to get motivated. Now, for me, studying Russian's a lot more fun than studying geometry. And so I've been studying Russian. And I might go through some of that stuff. Maybe I'll go through some of it now. The important thing to remember with languages is that you need several sources. There's not ever one panacea. It's like that, remember that Rosetta Stone thing came out? Where's Rosetta Stone now? It was so hyped. You paid $400, $500 for... And there's all these different levels you can get. You can get the deluxe level, Rosetta Stone for $500. You should never spend more than $500 to learn a language. It's not that expensive. Okay? You can get creative with some very minimal tools. And here's one. I'll give you an example. Okay, another fat weightlifter of a book. Okay, the Russian-English dictionary. This is a really good one, okay? And let me tell you why. When it comes to getting a Russian dictionary, you almost want to go into the bookstore and find it yourself, because with Russian words, you always want to be able to know where the stress lies in the word, because unlike English, the stress of the word can be on any syllable. Okay, now when you learn Spanish or Italian, usually the stress is on the second to the last syllable. In English, a lot of times it's on the first syllable. This dictionary gives the stress on each word. And if you don't learn the stress with each Russian word, you're going to fuck it all up. You're going to say everything wrong, and you're going to sound like a robot. Okay? So in order to get the proper pronunciation of Russian, you have to know where the stress lies in the word. And sometimes it shifts according to what form it takes. For instance, the Russian verb начать, which means to begin. When you put in the past tense feminine, it's начала. Okay, начала. She began. For the masculine, it's начал. Он начал. He began. Начал. Начала. Okay, so the stress changes according to form. So, that's Bulgarian. What the fuck? Feminine past indicative perfective of начать. Начала. I was right. Okay. And that's another thing. Wiktionary. Look up Wiktionary. Okay, moving on to Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Part 1 of this, the introduction, can be found on episode 10. And so we are moving forward with part 1. And so, what's the purported goal of the book, Between Two Ages? Well, it's to explain the nature, processes, and forces dominating and shaping the political world, the direction it's heading, how to shed the traditional forms of viewing it, basically create a socialist model, with hopes that the resulting program will change America's role on the world stage to create a metric by which we can determine our trajectory. The first part of the book, which he published in 1970, is based on an article he wrote, which came out 2 years before, called America in the Technotronic Age. He begins the book by positing a couple of paradoxes of the human condition, presumably to illustrate our neurosis and helplessness, and our need for a remedy. In the introduction, it is the paradox of more knowledge and information leaving us proportionately ignorant, confused, or lost. So somehow we need more of it. In part 1, it is humanity becoming more unified, at the same time becoming more fragmented. Of course, he offers the solution to both, not to spoil the surprise. And he proposes a grand vision, or guide, for the world leaders to commit to. He uses the word grand quite a bit, even in the titles for his books. The grand vision, the grand chessboard, the grand failure, etc. Now, Zbigniew Brzezinski is not just some egotistical, megomaniacal freelancer. He was in the position as counselor to President Lyndon Johnson and National Security Advisor to President Carter. in addition to holding seats in the highest levels of government and elite organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderberg Group. So he breaks down the necessity for us plebs down here to be shown the true state of our government and our desperate need for his particular guidance to usher us safely into a one-world government, given the inevitability of that situation in the near future, thanks to the attendant fallout from our rapid advances in technology and information overload. He tells us that world-shaking events and crises necessarily bring with them a polarity of opposing dialectic forces in the collective psyche. And these dialectics necessarily result in an eventual synthesis, which is that world system. He says that international priorities are manifested according to situational factors, inevitably bringing dominant forces to the fore. And once these dominant forces face off, there is no sane choice beyond cooperation and integration if the survival of humanity is to be achieved. We'll get more to that later. He argues that simple formulas fail to take in all the various situational factors governing disparate national entities, that formulations are tentative, so diplomatic strategies are in flux. Okay, Miles Copeland's book Game of Nations fits right in here, covering backroom war games played out in advance by our federal intelligence elite, each player taking turns playing out archetypal roles representing different leader types governing nations at various levels of development. So without these strategies, we're basically fucked. So if we wish to be the fuckers and not the fuckies, we'd better get with the program before some psychopathic dictator beats us to it. At that point, we may as well get back into the Stone Age and crawl back into our caves and await our eventual enslavement. By the time this book was written in 1970, over 50 years ago, Zbig considered the most highly advanced nations to be already leading the technotronic age. Technology and information changing every aspect of our existence and being the vehicle by which we enter into this age. Because the changes are so exponential in speed and complexity, we have to be able to keep a steady hand, guided by history and acuity. Where are we now? Where are we going? And how do we steer ourselves into the most advantageous position? Well, whom do we ask? Certainly not the people of Walmart. The pajama-wearing, face tattoo-sporting, drug-addled, porn-addicted, unemployed, homeless trenchcoat mafia we've come to call our neighbors. Of course, the author of this book is here to give us the right trajectory. Like Asimov's Foundation series, I guess we just consult his books. Like the Hari Seldon Vault, whenever we find ourselves in a civilizational pickle. So what are the disciplines he says we need to master in order to navigate this ourselves? History, probability and forecasting, statistics, international affairs, comprehensive assessment or systems analysis, an understanding of psychology, philosophy, knowledge of the scientific method, understanding how the world works, diplomacy, espionage. Part 1, which constitutes the meat of the original article, covers the impact of the scientific technological revolution on world affairs and the ambiguous position of the U.S. and analyzing the effects of this revolution. Now, on to part one. The global impact of the technotronic revolution. So, Zbigniew says humanity is simultaneously becoming more unified and more fragmented. And that is the meaning of contemporary change. What does he mean by that? Through technology, time and space seem to shrink or become compressed, rather. And global politics show a tendency toward interdependent cooperation and the thinning of institutions and ideologies. With the loosening, or now even abolition, of borders, we are cramming together into close quarters people of totally disparate cultures, which begets social tension, almost like what we see in prisons, or at least what we see in New York. In other words, he gives a description of our condition. Humanity becoming both unified and fragmented. Technology causing a shrinking of time and space, causing a shift in global politics, which becomes somehow larger and more convoluted, with an accompanying breakdown in our relationship to institutions and ideology. We tend to congest our population centers even more as we cleave to multifarious tribal alliances. In this condition, we are in as if a kind of pressure cooker, a prison-like setting. Okay, so I've said it twice. He asserts that a new pattern of politics is on the horizon. He sees national sovereignty as dissolving, as nations have become less homogeneous. In the past, nations were more self-contained, cut off from others, reinforcing consensus and identity among its citizens. Advances in travel and communications within borders further solidified consensus. Notice how now our establishment seeks to limit travel and speech. Now, weapons can be effectively deployed anywhere on the globe in minutes. Relationships between nations are more important than ever. Nationalism is weakening. The consequence is an era of global political process. Yet human unity remains elusive. The world itself is becoming like a city. People's allegiances are becoming fragmented. The effectiveness of law enforcement weakens. The potential for conflict is omnipresent, and low-level warfare is constant. As above, so below. Our international relations become a similar hodgepodge of activity. We no longer interact one-to-one among states. Corporations and financial institutions have grown into the international landscape and have exerted massive influence as well. International social and political movements are holding sway, especially now with social media providing a venue for these burgeoning structures, not to mention the international institutions and global superpowers. International policy starts to resemble that of a city, which is scary when you look at the way cities like Chicago and Detroit or even Portland are being run. Corruption is rampant. Violence becomes controlled, managed, and even sanctioned by top-down authority. Organized crime becomes not only accepted by government, but integrated into it. The government is now the new mob. The major international players control and manage a somewhat state of perpetual war over and between smaller states. international diplomacy is mildly effective. Local gang violence goes largely ignored, while subversive activity and attacks on private or commercial property are taken seriously and effectively combated. Okay. Now consider the 2020 summer riots. Funny how things wind up. Compare with the response to the January 6th protests. Similarly, conflicts within and among third world nations are ignored by the bigger players on the world stage, unless these conflicts begin to spill out into the realm of the more advanced and powerful states. Wars in the third world are tolerable as long as their international scale is contained at a level that doesn't threaten major interests. Okay, factors inhibiting the outbreak of war between advanced industrial nations post-1945. 1. Development of nuclear weapons. 2. Formation of power blocks and multilateral alliance systems. And 3. The increasing financial cost of modern warfare. David Woods' book, Conflict in the 20th Century, from 1968, contains a list of 80 conflicts that occurred between 1945 and 1967. All but 8 of them involved third world participants on both sides. A large number of them have followed on or been associated with the breakup of colonial empires. The subsequent emergence of new states are often small, poor, and insecure. He talks about a shift from sustained warfare, made possible by the industrial age, to sporadic outbreaks of violence. In earlier times, we had head-on battles with decisive victories and defeats. With the industrial age, we mobilized manpower and supplies for prolonged but indecisive struggles. Nuclear weapons tend to freeze their possessors into passive restraint, with the aforementioned sporadic outbreaks of violence occurring on the peripheries of the confrontation. Sort of makes me think about what's happening right now with America's involvement in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Sort of a proxy war. Only they don't really know what they're messing with, because nuclear war still looms. In the past, violence tended to result in the use of maximum available power. Today, those nations possessing maximum power strive to employ a minimum in the assertion of their interests. Okay, that right there is near verbatim from the text. No changes or paraphrasing necessary. The destructive power of nuclear weapons has had the effect of softening conflict between the most powerful states. Without them, the U.S. would certainly have already gone to war with the Soviet Union. These weapons have created a novel system of deterrence from the reliance of overwhelming power. Zbigniew says, in urban politics, the weakness of law enforcement authority is compensated by a sense of higher allegiance to the nation. And that element is lacking in global politics. Now the globalist's job is to try and create that metastructure. Otherwise, the mixing and adulteration of cultures that happens with mass immigration can get really messy. Okay, now we can see the motive behind the policy of open borders, and what the current power structure is pushing in the U.S., and what has gone on in Europe over the past 2 decades or so. This is a push towards globalism, a world government. This very agenda is explicitly stated by many of the global elite over the last century. The nation states are going away. In the process, international politics become more and more interdependent. And then in the last paragraph, he kind of lets the cat out of the bag. Zbig says that the eras are arbitrarily delineated. That we, in hindsight, determine certain milestones on a road which concurrently remains imperceptible. Neither the beginning nor the end of an era can be sharply demarcated. The protocols of global process largely operate the same as in times past, but the inner reality is increasingly shaped by forces which transcend national boundaries, namely influences brought about through technology and everything that comes along with it. So basically AI. So this technocracy is inevitable. A one-world global government is inevitable. And therefore, according to old Zbigniew Brzezinski, should be guided as deliberately and decisively as possible. Okay, so that's it for now, for Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Okay, so I think the next thing I'm going to do is go through part 2 of the Nyctalops trilogy by Thomas Ligotti. Part 1 can be found on episode 3. Okay, so it's another day. You can see that I've gotten my hair cut since 5 minutes ago. I'm still wearing the same shirt. I probably look about 10 years older. I feel that way anyway. So the next story that we're going to move on to here is Thomas Ligotti's The Nyctalops trilogy from Songs of a Dead Dreamer. We did part 1 a while back. So just to summarize the first part, The Chemist, which carries with it an alchemical motif. It's a sort of one-sided monologue that weaves through a short narrative involving a sort of narcissistic, psychopathic man who's priming this hooker to go home with her, but he doesn't plan on having sex with her. He has other plans. In his briefcase, he has an experimental drug that he wants to use on her in order to somehow shape her into his own liking and imagination, making her a slave. So she ingests the drug willingly, and from that point forward they're bonded, her body reacting to his mind. So sort of a bit of transhumanism going on here. She's essentially and chemically changed and not expected to recover. So that was part 1, The Chemist, and you can find that in episode 3. So the next installment, part 2, is called Drink to Me Only with Labyrinthine Eyes. And this was my favorite part of the trilogy. I mean, it's a pretty creepy story. The first one's pretty creepy, but this one's really bad. So here it goes. So the story, narrated in the first person, may perhaps be the same protagonist from the first installment, but I really don't think so. Not in the physical sense, because it seems that it's spiritually the same person. It's sort of the spirit of a sort of a sadist, a sadistic person. And it seems to me he is more of a type or even an archetype or spirit who has possessed or even infected normal or maybe psychopathic men. It is a person so evil and callous who can only derive pleasure from the torture and torment of another. He starts out with this conceited boast, sort of like the guy from, from the chemist. He started with a conceited boast as well. But this guy boasts of his abilities, or rather his attributes he was born with. Speaking first about his extraordinary eyes, which draw comments and inquiries about their authenticity from other people. And along with this singular feature he claims to have been born with, the innate ability for mesmerism and hypnosis, which has taken him into this uncanny profession of his. So he's at this party, and, well, imagine being so naturally endowed that even the so-called highest members of society are enthralled by your very presence and entranced by your every move. He's been hired as an entertainment act for this sort of upper crust soiree. So his assistant on this venture also seems to be quite charming to all these guests. But it may not be her innate qualities which attract them. Let's not forget this man's talent for hypnotism. So they are mingling after the performance, and several people want to meet them. He had instructed the host that no alcohol was to be served before the performance, and the furniture would be arranged in such a way which allowed the guests an unobstructed view. As the show began, the magician, or hypnotist, had the stage set with dramatic lighting and 2 synchronized metronomes, topped with replicas of his peculiar eyes. He spoke to the audience, explaining hypnosis and presenting a cabinet, which he said contains the most beautiful creature ever beheld, and that she is already in a trance and waiting. He casts his eyes against the audience and opens the cabinet door. The audience gasps. Then the applause. The figure exhibited before them is standing upright inside the cabinet, with her arms held still at her sides, wearing a tiny sequined outfit. Her gaze seems to be fixed on infinity. At his signal, she falls forward, and he catches her, restoring her to her original position. He places her body between 2 chairs and invites a fat man from the audience to come up and sit on her. Then he stuffs her into a small box. The audience is enraptured. They secretly wish to see something go wrong. Next is the human voodoo doll, where he sticks long pins into her flesh, and she doesn't wince or make a sound. They perform a few other routines in defiance of pain. He reminds the audience that his subject is in deep trance. They do hear her speak, and they do see her raise her arms and spread her legs into the shape of a star. They do see her lift her head. She stares into the audience with a radiant glare. Okay, so I want to draw a parallel. In any case where I detect parallels between the different stories or books that I describe here, I want to make note of them. And one of them was in the Introduction to Tragedy and Hope 101 by Joseph Plummer. The introduction was actually written by, can't remember the guy's name, Griffin something. The guy who wrote The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is the story of how the Federal Reserve came into being. And he talked about how a magician can, even in front of a suspecting audience who's looking for sleight of hand, a good magician can pull off amazing illusions that will trick the entire crowd in a live audience who's looking for deception. And how the secret government, on a larger scale, like what more could the government do to mislead a general population of people who trust it, who aren't looking for the sleight of hand, people who willingly go along. And so I'm looking at this story and I'm thinking about him doing exactly this, and I almost got the same mental picture when I was reading the segment from the Introduction to Tragedy and Hope 101, possibly because I'd already read the story fairly recently before that. But it just made me think of that, and now let's rebound this back to this story and this Nyctalops story, the second installment of the trilogy. What's it called again? Drink to me only with labyrinthine eyes. I'm reading off my notes here. So, what could it say about this story, hearkening back to that introduction, where it speaks about governments using sleight of hand to manipulate a whole audience of unsuspecting people? Okay, so as we continue on with the story, the details will be revealed. So far we've got this sort of magician / hypnotist standing in front of a small audience in like a living room of a mansion, and he's giving a performance, and the lighting is set a certain way, and he's got this natural talent, this natural gift of hypnotism, and he produces a cabinet, and inside the cabinet is a woman or a girl, and he opens the cabinet, and there she is in all her splendor, and everybody is shocked and amazed by her radiant beauty. And because he's told them how beautiful she is. And she falls out, he catches her, and proceeds to inflict all these painful looking proceedings upon her, such as the needles through the flesh kind of thing, the big fat guy sitting on her, and so forth. So where are we now? So the hypnotist demands complete silence from the audience, to which they do oblige. He then announces that she will metamorphose. He tells them they can see her glowing. They see her begin to shine radiantly. He tells them they can see white rings. White rings. White wings. I can't even read my own handwriting. He tells them they can see white wings sprouting from behind her shoulders in a labyrinth of light. They stand enwrapped in the spectacle. She is the essence of the ethereal. This strains? This strains the capacity of the hypnotist, and the light fades in the eyes of the audience. Usually I read from a typed version of my notes, but this is handwritten, and my handwriting's really bad. The grand finale is met with mild applause. Okay, so I'm going to kind of repeat that section there. He tells them they can see, okay, let me back up a little bit. He then announces that she will metamorphose. He tells them they can see the glowing. They see her begin to shine radiantly. He tells them they can see white wings sprouting from behind her shoulders and a labyrinth of light. They stand enwrapped in the spectacle. She is the essence of the ethereal. This strains the capacity of the hypnotist, and the light fades in the eyes of the audience. The grand finale is met with mild applause. A bit of an anticlimax. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. He sort of chortles and tells the audience that they seem to be in a sort of trance themselves. And at the sound of a chime, they too will wake up. After the show, the hypnotist, along with his lovely assistant, begin to silk. No, they begin to mix. They begin to mix the milk. Okay, after the show, the hypnotist, along with his lovely assistant, begin to mix with the partygoers. Drinks are served. Drinks are served, and the conversation ramps up. And so the noise level in the room is increased, and the guests break off into their little separate groups. Okay? A group coagulates around the pair, and the hypnotist slips away unnoticed. The guests take turns dancing with the hypnotist's assistant, the lovely assistant, and getting drinks for her. She simply smiles, vacant and full of grace, not even sipping from her drink. They are transfixed by her beauty. A few of the guests try and get the hypnotist's attention. He gives out a few business cards with different names and phone numbers on them. He keeps his eye on his somnambulant assistant. The walls bend and undulate. Some of the guests sway and stumble, but his subject remains in perfect harmony with the room. People dance with her and take pictures. The host leads her into the bar area and shows her some of the decor. She holds a figurine in her hand, looking at it blankly. They are all taken in by her dispassionate elegance. As our hypnotist watches, he notices a little boy appear at the top of the staircase. Apparently, he has been woken out of his sleep by the noisy guests, and he sits down at the top of the stairs. The hypnotist goes up the stairs to meet him. He sits down next to him and asks if he saw the performance earlier. No, the boy replies. The hypnotist asks if the boy sees the lady presently and produces a silver pen out of his pocket and points down into the room below. The boy nods his head. At this distance, they can't really see her in much detail. "Well, what do you think?" the hypnotist asks. The boy replies, She's yucky." So he hypnotizes the boy with his pen and instructs him to go to bed, where he'll have good dreams and not awake until morning. And he gives the boy his pen as a reminder that nothing is what it seems to be. And before sending him to bed, asks him if there is a back stairway by which he can leave. The boy points down the hall and slinks off back to bed. The hypnotist stands for a moment, staring down into the ballroom, where the general excitement has reached a climax. His subject is caught up in the party's web below. Her master, quite forgotten. But he is not jealous. After all, he told them all how beautiful and perfect she is. They know not what draws their fancy. After all, the angelified version of her was least interesting to them. They wanted to be thrilled. Well, time to awaken this mob from its hypnotic slumber and give them the thrill of a lifetime. It is time for the chime. He takes the back stairway and goes out into the yard. He takes a moment to enjoy the stars and reflects that even the stars could not out-hypnotize him. He knows the human weakness all too well and would rather be the deceiver than the deceived. To hypnotize the dead would be a high art. But what good are they anyway? They do have their uses if you can remove them from their resting places. When the mood strikes, they can be employed as part of the show. After all, they don't resist much. But you cannot make them beautiful. Yet, if your skills at suggestibility are adept, you can convince an audience. There it is right there. If your skills of suggestibility are adept, you can convince an audience. He stands outside another minute, listening to the laughing, high society vulgarians still making a fuss over his charismatic doll of the dead. He showed them what she might be. Now, it was time to show them what she really is. The doorbell chime will awaken them. Then, they will see her wounds, her eyes sunken into their rotting depths. They'll wake up to find her residue all over their clothes and get a whiff of her smell. So that's it. It's the end of the story. Pretty brutal, huh? So, yeah, there's the thread that goes through these stories of the Nyctalops. It's this 3-part triptych. It's not, I don't want to say trilogy because that makes it sound really long. This 3-part triptych, it carries the theme of the spirit of evil in man, which enacts sadistic tendencies and sadistic and manipulative tendencies upon women, sort of bringing them into himself and possessing them. In this case of this story, the dead woman, it's sort of this boastful show, where in the first one he was boasting towards the woman that he, had all his ducks in a row and he was this really successful guy, and that he had this, he was very intelligent, had this depth of character, that, he was so accomplished at such a young age, and he had so much understanding and appreciation for even the dark side of reality, and how even the ugly things are beautiful, and how it's just peculiar to his particular intellect that he understands that everything is in constant flux and everything changes. And then in the second one, he's very prideful about his ability to manipulate other people through his appearance and through his natural gifts. And the last one we'll get to later, but it kind of just to foreshadow it a little bit, it does carry with it sort of the same idea of enslaving, like a psychopathic, narcissistic man who has this secret habit of sort of possessing and enslaving women unto himself, to their demise. And so we'll get to that later. So that's the Nyctalops trilogy. That's the first two installments of the Nyctalops trilogy by Thomas Ligotti. Okay, so for this last section, I'm going to go through Carl Jung's Psychology of the Unconscious, originally titled, and I know I'm going to butcher this because my German sucks, Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, okay, which quite literally means transformations and symbols of the libido. So it starts off with Eugene Taylor's foreword. The book is basically a rewriting or reconstruction of Freud's libido theory, rejecting the interpretation of an exclusively sexual core of the life energy, or libido, in favor of a larger definition encompassing the totality of one's experience. Jung utilizes a method of symbolism. Freud focused on a wish fulfillment as the origin of neurosis. Jung saw myths as wish-fulfilling prophecies, encapsulating the entire evolutionary psychic life of the human species. Whether or not the individual ever had any personal acquaintance with the myths of the great world cultures, the psychopathological experience constitutes a return to primitive and instinctual forces, which admit hallucinations and visions into the conscious waking field. The symbolism inherent in these hallucinations also recur in the myths of the great world cultures. But beyond merely a psychology of the neurosis, Jung observes the self-actuating or self-actualizing aspect of symbolic experience. That contained in the unconscious is not merely the symbols of mental degradation towards the primitive, but also the evolutionary journey towards self-individuation. The symbol and the dream or hallucination hold the key to understanding psychopathology. And the libido is likewise spiritualized by the symbols which contain the power of the living myth. In the case of the individual, actualization of the ideas of the myth is expressed in prefiguring their personal destiny. Thus originates the motifs of the hero's birth, rebirth into a higher state, the idea of an enlightened personality, our conception of ultimate reality, and humanity's spiritual goals. These experiences are accessed through Jung's methods of word association, dream interpretation, active imagination, and mandala symbolism. So that is just a bit of contrast here between Freud and Jung. Jung's description of inward versus outward thinking and introvert versus extrovert types draws on William James to some extent. Dissociative theories of unconscious materials leaking into the waking field under psychopathological conditions draws on Pierre Janet. Occupying the majority of this book is the mythic and visionary scope of the unconscious. Breaking from the Viennese school of psychoanalysis, Jung's concurrent frame of reference is rather the late 19th century psychologies of transcendence and spiritual growth, which would later morph into his entire outlook, comprising his school of analytical psychology. According to Anthony Sutich, the field of existential humanistic psychology, as by the 1960s, drew heavily on Aldous Huxley, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Rollo May, Alan Watts, and some aspects of Carl Jung. Throughout the many literary works of Carl Jung, and I've read quite a few, constant reference is made towards the idea that all the mystical, quote, mumbo-jumbo of magic and voodoo, and mythological motifs and relics, are themselves the very real and factual materials with which the process of science can synthesize into a concrete edifice for objective observation. The book, Transformations of the Libido, marks the split between Freud and Jung. Until the time it was written, Jung remained a loyal disciple to Freud. But Jung's expanded interpretation of the idea of the libido to include all psychic energy with all its attendant mythological symbolic material, as opposed to Freud's strictly sexual theory, was an irreconcilable, fundamental difference in viewpoint. From that point forward, Jung could no longer faithfully represent the Freudian school of psychoanalysis. This caused Jung immeasurable consternation and distress, regardless of how supportive and amiable Freud tried to be in his letters and even in his public statements. Jung was so bothered by it because he knew the end was near for them. The situation was exacerbated by the suicide of Jung's protege, young J.J. Honegger. Although the famous Miller fantasies constitute the main thrust of Transformations, or at least the skin, which covers the underlying thesis of the book, namely the mythological motifs inherent in the symbolic representations present in the fantasy material, attendant to the dreams and hallucinations of the psychopathological individual case, regardless of whether their experience included knowledge of such material. The book begins with a paper titled Two Kinds of Thinking. This paper describes both passive and active thought processes, the former involving reverie, meditation, and dreaming. The latter, directed intellectual type thought, which requires work or sustained outward effort that tends to make one tired. Basically, the you during a math exam versus the you tripping on shrooms under the oak tree. When it gets into the Miller fantasies, we begin to see how the first, passive type of thinking over a prolonged period can result in a flooding into the conscious field of unconscious fantasy material containing mythological motifs, figures, and symbols. Jung would later come to term these unconscious determinants as manifestations emanating from the archetypes or patterns of a collective unconscious. This collective unconscious, being common to all humans, developed over millennia by the total history of all human experience. The archetypes being a kind of psychic organ, if you will, like how we all share a common visceral biological structure, like the stomach, heart, lungs, intestines, etc. Likewise, we all possess, in the deepest recesses of the psyche, certain metaphysical determinants which are only indirectly verifiable, comparable and likened to animal instincts that have shaped our world religions, mythologies, and cultures since time immemorial. Now, this seems like kind of a lot to try and swallow all at one time, and of course it is. And many scientists and clinicians in the field reject it outright. But I do think that many of us who have taken the hero's journey and tripped out on 4 hits of blotter acid, or taken an eighth of shrooms straight to the dome, and maybe caught a glimpse of Ezekiel taking the fiery chariot across the firmament, or actually seen a Cyclops or two, or little gnomes in the grass, or Perseus out of the corner of his eye walking into the Mickey D's, can attest to the veracity of such things. I've totally been there. So that's it for Carl Jung's, or my little section on Carl Jung's psychology of the unconscious, or transformations and symbols of the libido. So that about wraps it up for this episode. It's been fun making this one, and hopefully you get as much out of it as I did, and I'm going to try and make more of these. I sort of like the format of the 4 episode, or 4 installments per episode, 4 books per episode, and just kind of getting into some new stuff and bringing in some of the old at the same time, and just sort of cycling through some of these books. It's kind of like the method by which I read the books. I spend a little chunk of time on each one, and then I move on to something else, and then I get around to the previous stuff eventually. And so I'll probably do the same kind of method with these videos, and I'd like to get into more different kinds of stuff. I'd like to do some ones where I don't necessarily talk about books. Maybe I get into music, or into foreign language, or into crypto, or something else. These are things I've been wanting to touch on for a little while and haven't necessarily had a chance to do it. But anyway, thank you for listening, and see you next time.